Good morning. I wanted to talk today about the difficult parts of life. These are really the feelings that are right underneath the surface that we would rather not feel or pay attention to. Real feelings associated with real experiences, real concerns, and real suffering. As someone, and I'm just going to speak for myself here, who's a very enthusiastic person, I love getting excited about life and seeing people thrive and feel great. I'm a sucker for any human interest story in the Olympics. You know how they have that little break and you find out the background story as to all that had to take place in order for this person to reach such a high level of performance. Because of this craving for growth, for progress, and for good outcomes, it's easier to stay with experiences that inspire rather than to stay with experiences that are difficult and don't really have an end point to resolving themselves. I see this tendency in myself. I see this tendency in our culture. And reflecting about why we have this tendency to seek only the positive, I wonder about those formational experiences as a child. I wonder in particular about that TV sitcom formula, the Brady Bunch formula. Go back a bit with me a little bit. Episodes always followed a certain sequence. The day started out well. You had a full breakfast, right? Cooked and prepared. And then there is some problem that occurred. And that involved a parent intervening. And then by the end of the episode, which was 30 minutes, including commercials, all had been resolved. All was well. And so if we take this on face value, I wonder about our ability to stay with things that are difficult really is only about 30 minutes, because that's how we've been trained to be. After that, we get impatient and want to move on. While this problem appears to be innocent on the surface, and this isn't a sermon about TV, I wonder if our limited capacity to tolerate difficult feelings over a long period of time keeps us from addressing hard issues that do need to be addressed. Let me be specific, just as an example. Programmers who program the apps that you and I enjoy, if you're sitting in a grocery store line, what's the first thing you do when you have to wait there? Right? Pull it out, right? There's some kind of reward system that's kind of built in. It shapes us neurologically. It keeps us wanting to go back to it. It has an addictive kind of quality to it, right? It starts to take control over our behavior. Now, we could focus on this as like, yes, it's really causing disconnection between people, breakdown and isolation and anxiety we see on the rise. And we could develop an app that would really actually do the same thing, but not hook us in quite the same way, not limit our freedom. I wonder if our capacity to stay with difficult experiences and to address issues like this, just as an example, where we would be as a society if we could just have the staying power to hang in there with things that just are hard. Part of the role of prophets and of the Psalms in Hebrew Scriptures are to give voice to the hard moments, to those emotions that people are feeling around great loss. They give voice to what was unspoken and hard to tolerate. They bring attention to the issues, so people are no longer avoiding them. And when they do, the whole experience of life is honored. If one wants to heal from trauma and hardship, we need to express our grief. The passages that I'm referring to are called laments, and they are both our Old Testament lesson for today as well as our psalm. The prophets in the Hebrew Scriptures are active during a period, let me give you the context of our reading, during a period which is called the Exile. Many of you are familiar with this. The Hebrew people were taken out of Israel, out of their land where they knew God and knew purpose and were united as a people, and taken captive to a land called Babylonia, away from what they knew and where they found God. And this taking away wasn't just like a sleepover. You know, they weren't going for a sleepover in another nation. It was all open-ended. No one knew when this was going to resolve itself. So they were sitting with a sense of uncertainty and loss. And the prophets give voice to all that they are feeling. Our psalm for today is Psalm 139. It happens to be one of my favorites. And it's written about this time of dislocation. The Hebrew people are lost. They're raising questions about how could God let this happen? Where is God's protection? And the first few verses capture so well their life experience and give voice to what others might just want to gloss over so they can assimilate into the Babylonian culture, start making money again, life is good, whatever that is, right? Instead, you'll hear the raw experience in the words themselves. The psalmist writes, "By the waters of Babylon, we sat down and we wept. When we remembered you, O Zion, Jerusalem. As for our harps, we hung them up on the trees in the midst of that land. For those who led us away captive asked us for a song. Our oppressors called for mirth. Sing us one of those songs of Zion. How shall we sing the Lord's song upon an alien soil? By the waters of Babylon, we sat down and we wept. We are no longer a strong people. They sat in defeat. We stopped singing. The song in our hearts is no longer there. And those who led us away, they mock us. Sing us one of those hopeful songs. How can we sing in a place that is not our home?" The psalm gives voice to what is so honest and pure about their experience. They are in touch with loss. You can feel their grief. They're defeated and they've lost what unites them together, their land. But this gives way for their healing. The great songwriter Don McLean composed a song on his American Pie album, which was released in 1971 during the Vietnam War. And the song was entitled Babylon. And that entire song is the first verse of our psalm today. By the waters of Babylon, we sat down and we wept when we remembered you, O Zion. Surprising that a folk musician would use scripture to speak of dislocation for his cultural moment. That estrangement from home resonated with him. And as you listen to it, it's a haunting song with just his voice and banjo. By the waters of Babylon, we sat down and wept when we remembered you, O Zion. Our Old Testament lesson for Lamentations is also a lament about that same period of exile. It gives voice to this collective grief and search for understanding and orientation. The loneliness that is experienced in Jerusalem is compared to a widow who is asking the question, will this be forever? Is this the destination of our city? I wonder about this practice today. I wonder who is the voice of our grief and loss, especially in this moment, especially with what we have experienced over the last 2 years. Of the extreme polemical sides to our national debate, losing that sense of unity and strength as a country, giving voice to our grief of isolation in the pandemic and grief around our lack of unity as a country. I wonder what the long-term consequences are of not dealing well over several generations with grief. This learned behavior to only seek the positive and the inspirational. All that is happening right now, especially now. In the last month, the U.S. Preventative Services Task Force that gives guidance for our doctors about their care of patients recommends that all physicians screen people who are under 65 for anxiety and depression because of the effect the pandemic has had on all of us. In this article, it says that this is to help prevent mental health disorders from going undetected, untreated for years or even decades. And it made a similar recommendation earlier this year for children and teenagers. Their advice is to help people grieve and lament, giving voice to what has been unspoken for so long. It makes me wonder about the amount of grief, since this pattern has been going on for some while, the amount of grief that is just underneath the surface, hidden behind forced smiles and broken hearts. How well we would be served by some kind of accepted practice of grieving, of truly mourning, and not ignoring the suffering that we experience. In my years of pastoral care, many of you have heard this directly from me. The truth that I always share about grief is, if you do not deal with grief, it will deal with you. Period. It'll manifest itself in your body. It is not well. It is a presence that is greater than us, and we need to give voice to it, and our scriptures model that for us today. This is the gift of the role of the prophets, so that people can move on, so that people can heal. Now, in our gospel lesson today, we hear this request by the apostles, increase our faith. With some little volume, there's an exclamation point in your text there. Increase our faith. They're passionate about this. And I know we also share, many of us share that same hope that we want our faith to be connected or to be increased. And maybe wondering in our own mind, there's some rationale behind wanting more faith. That if we had more faith, our lives would be better off, we think, in our minds. Maybe I wouldn't have suffered, or the person I was praying for wouldn't have suffered if I would have had more faith in my prayer, or they would have been better off. And we start to equate faith with avoiding difficulties. And we're now back into the same pattern. See what I mean? We're asking for increased faith so we don't have to feel the hard feelings. And only that starts to limit the healing alone. But what might happen if we brought together our grief and our faith? What might happen if we bring together our grief and our faith of giving voice to our disappointment and asking God the difficult questions of why, of offering a lament to God for all that is in our hearts? One would think that that would keep us in a stuck place. What's the point? But that has not been my experience. When I've given voice to the grief in my heart in the context of faith, I have come to recognize that my faith is not determined by outcome. My faith is not determined by the circumstances of my life. That I can have faith and I can be going through a hard moment together. Right? Because faith is not determined by outcome. Faith is determined by love. A loving relationship with a great God, with our hope and a love that redeems us and claims us. So if I were to answer the demand of the apostles, increase our faith, I would encourage them to connect their faith with all of their life. And to know and pray the difficult experiences that we all have, because they are formational. And we know Christ, who offered his life for us, knew this firsthand. Your faith will increase if you increase your faith's connection to your life. So what is the invitation for us today? It's to recognize that counterintuitive leadership of the prophets who helped the Hebrew people express their grief and lead them into understanding, to seek God's hand in the process of all of life, to bring together their grief and their faith, and to trust, even though we can't see it, to trust that a new path indeed will come. So start by crafting your own prayer of lament that captures the essence of your heart in your life. And pray that prayer to God and allow God's Spirit to meet you in that place and in that prayer. God, is a great God whose mercy and love are among the greatest of all things. Prayers for peace this week. Amen.